Hello, everyone. I'm Scott Warner, a partner in Husch Blackwell's education group. Thank you so much for joining our program today, which we've entitled Navigating Issues Involving Student Death and Serious Injury. Before we begin, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are a number of application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the program, we encourage you to submit them using the question box. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible today, but with limited time, we may need to answer some of them after our program concludes, and we'll do that using email if we can't get to your questions today. You'll also be able to access a copy of the presentation in the program materials folder. This program has also been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, you can use the CEU icon at the bottom of your screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for reviewing and sharing. Toward the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We really appreciate your feedback, and we use it to plan our future programming. We really do appreciate any feedback you might have. Presenting with me today are my colleagues shown here today, Alex Rushing, AJ James, and Catherine Tierney. Alex, AJ, and Catherine and I all advise educational institutions on investigations, a range of compliance matters, and litigation that often arises from the situations we face, along with our clients. This includes handling internal agency complaints, such as OCR complaints. It also includes representing institutions in a broad range of litigation, including matters arising under Title IX and other anti-discrimination laws, employment disputes, premises liability and tort claims, and breach of contract disputes. That's it for the housekeeping items. So now I'd like to get started with our programming today. In terms of our agenda, these are the issues that we'll be talking about, the first of which is the scope of issues involving student death and serious injury, various serious and challenging issues that we all have to face sometimes, unfortunately. We'll talk about some best practices for hopefully avoiding situations that can give rise to self-harm, suicide, and other serious injuries. We'll also talk about protocols and recommended best practices for responding to these situations when they do arise. And my colleague AJ in particular will be talking about a number of court decisions and other lessons that can be learned from litigation that often arises when these situations do unfortunately occur. Before we get started with the substance, I do just want to pause for a moment and acknowledge the seriousness of this topic. We know it's a heavy and difficult topic, and probably one that a number of people who are listening in today have had to deal with on their campuses, and even for those who perhaps haven't yet had to deal with it. These issues are ones that we're all concerned about and worried about, and really go to the core of our critical mission as institutions of higher education in terms of serving and supporting students and trying to help those students who might be dealing with a difficult situation. We're mindful of the gravity of dealing with these situations and even having to think about them. With that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Catherine Tierney, to get us started today.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you everyone for being here today. We're going to begin by talking about the scope of issues involving student death and serious injury. And to get us started, we're actually going to do a poll. So to get a sense of who's with us today and what experiences you all might have had, our question is, has your institution experienced a situation involving a serious student injury or death by suicide in the last year? You can see those options are yes, no, and I don't know. So I'm going to just give us a minute for responses to come into that so we can get a sense of who all is here. See responses trickling in. That's good. Give it just another couple of seconds here. All right. So we're going to look at the results now. We've got about 75% responses. And so you can see that over half of us here today have experienced one of these situations. About 35% have not, and 10% aren't sure. And so we'll talk about some statistics now to kind of give context and maybe explain why over half of us here today have some kind of experience with the situation. So we're going to start kind of broadly talking about individuals who are ages 15 to 24, which is the age of the average college student, although of course not all of our college students. And so according to the CDC, suicide was the third leading cause of death for individuals aged 15 to 24 in 2020. And over 6,000 individuals in that age range died by suicide in just that year alone. In terms of other serious injury and concerns like that, self-harm by poisoning was the 9th leading non-fatal reason for individuals 15 to 24 to be admitted to the emergency room. And you might think 9th seems kind of low down on the list, but you'll see that over 74,000 individuals were admitted to the emergency room for this reason. So you can see self-harm and suicide are very prevalent problems that often lead to hospitalization. Moving a little more specifically to college students, you'll see that there are approximately 1,100 suicides on college campuses each year. And the Healthy Mind Study collected data by surveying college students to get a sense of the scope of this problem. And that study found that 14% of students reported suicidal ideation within the past year, 6% reported making a suicide plan within the past year, 2% reported a suicide attempt within the past year, and 24%, so nearly a quarter of students, reported some form of non-suicidal self-injury in the past year. You can see this is a very prevalent problem, and it makes sense that 50% of the individuals who are here today have had some experience with these issues at their institutions. When we're considering these statistics, it's important to remember other identities that students have that may increase or decrease their risk of suicide or self-harm. So of course, suicide can impact individuals of any background, but according to the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, men are more likely to die by suicide than women. Suicide impacts individuals across all racial backgrounds, but American Indian or Alaskan Native individuals are at the greatest risk. And according to the Trevor Project, LGBTQIA+ youth are 4 times more likely than their peers to attempt suicide. So you can see that identities from racial to gender identity to sexual orientation can all impact an individual's risk of suicide. And we'll turn now and look at a graph that kind of shows some of that. So this graph shows rates of suicide by race and ethnicity in the United States, and it's the rate per 100,000 individuals. So you can see that top blue line is American Indian or Alaskan Native individuals. The line just below that in yellow is white individuals. The green line is for individuals, or is the average across racial demographics. And then you'll see that Black or African American, Hispanic, and Asian or Pacific Islander individuals are all at a lower than average risk, but you'll see that none of these groups have a risk of 0. So there is risk across all groups, but it's important to kind of be aware of which groups might be at a greater risk. Now that we've kind of overviewed some statistics and gotten a sense of the big picture here, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about some examples and some relevant litigation. I'm going to turn it over to AJ James to have that conversation.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so we're going to go over a couple cases here, mainly that deal with 4 different specific factual scenarios. Those being, as you can see on the screen, student death by suicide, accidental student death, intentional serious injury to one student by a fellow student, and then also intentional serious injury by an unknown party. Usually when we look at that unknown party, we're looking at, generally speaking, individuals not affiliated with the university. We don't always know that. Sometimes an unknown party, hard to determine if they're an outside actor or somebody else within the university that just has an identity that's unknown. At any rate, there's 2 real questions we kind of look at when we're going through these cases. The first is, do we have a legal duty to try to prevent harm? And if the answer to that question is yes, then what exactly is that duty and how do we satisfy it? And I think it's important to talk about before we get started with the individual cases this is a very, very, fact-specific inquiry that's going to depend widely on the facts, or at least the alleged facts of each individual circumstance. It's also going to depend very widely depending on the law of the state that your institution is in. Especially when it comes to the existence of a duty and kind of, what constitutes a breach of that duty is going to vary pretty widely depending on where you're located. And even within a jurisdiction, depending on what one or two of those little tiny factual variances may end up with a completely different outcome. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by looking at our first example. So this is an example of a student death by suicide. In this instance, we had a student who had previously met with university officials concerning some accommodations they needed for testing. During that process, they disclosed, quote, frequent suicidal thoughts. But at the same time, the student indicated that they were not an imminent suicide risk and did not have any plans to take their own life, nor had they, acted on that within any recent time period. As part of that process, the student and the officials attempted to keep in touch with one another so that they could keep an eye on any needs the student might have, and obviously from the university's perspective, stay in touch and kind of keep their finger on the pulse of any differences or developments in the student's life. Eventually, about 2 years later, from this initial meeting, the student committed suicide on campus immediately following a call with university officials for a completely separate matter, where they were discussing the tone and professionalism of an email. The student's family sued the institution, claiming wrongful death and negligence based off a failure to prevent harm, given the comment of frequent suicidal thoughts that had occurred roughly 2 years prior to the date of suicide. So with that factual background, just at the outset here, we have another poll question. Basically, given those facts, what do you all think is the answer to this question? Did the institution have responsibility for failing to prevent harm in this particular case? So go ahead and submit your answers. We'll give everybody a couple seconds here to think about things and respond. Seeing some answers roll in, so I'll leave it open for about 10 more seconds or so. All right, let's see what we think. Okay, so I don't know, probably pretty good answer. That's kind of the intent, that out here at the beginning that we're going to go over some of these things, talk about the relevant considerations. But for those of you who did take a side one way or the other, 17% believe the institution would be responsible, 54.5% no. And I will kind of cover the end of this case and kind of highlight the big takeaways from it, which will show why no is the answer in this particular instance. The first big takeaway from this case that the court examined was under what circumstances can a duty to prevent self-harm exist? And without making this an exhaustive list, the two instances that were identified were instances where an institution has actual knowledge of a student's suicide attempt while they're enrolled at the university or on university grounds. The thought process there being that if there is an actual knowledge that this person has attempted suicide in the past, there arises a duty to take some kind of reasonable actions to prevent harm to that student in the future. Second instance where a duty could exist are instances where a institution comes to have actual knowledge of a student's plan to commit suicide in short order. Basically, at that point, if the institution has credible knowledge that a student plans to harm themselves, well, then it triggers a duty to take reasonable steps to prevent that harm. In this particular factual case, the court determined that these circumstances were not present and there was no duty to prevent harm. based on a number of different factual issues, mostly being that the student had only discussed suicidal thoughts 2 years prior, and in that intervening 2 years had not exhibited any behavior that would indicate a risk of harm to the student self, and the student's actual affirmative denial that they had any suicidal ideations or plan to act on it at any time. That representation by the students given credit on the part of the institution. But again, the duty that exists here, or the duty that could exist, was not found to exist in this case, is to take reasonable steps to prevent harm. Now, that's important to note because it's not a sort of strict liability standard. So if there are steps, if there is a duty that exists and reasonable steps are taken and harm still results to the student, that's not necessarily an instance of responsibility or liability on the part of the institution if they took reasonable steps to prevent that harm, which of course begs the question, what exactly counts as reasonable steps towards efforts to prevent that harm? So turning to our next case, we have Tang versus Harvard College. In this instance, a student had previously reported to their health services personnel. They had attempted suicide, but have represented they did not currently have suicidal ideations or a plan to commit suicide. The institution immediately acted to help provide or find inpatient care for this student. The student was in fact placed in inpatient care in a hospital for a period of a week. At the end of a week, the hospital, which was separate from the institution, discharged the student, allowed them to go back into the community. The student did not, it was in the middle of a semester when this occurred, so the student did not finish the end of the semester, but did meet with college personnel to talk about a plan to return to the institution at the beginning of the next academic semester, which would have been roughly 5 to 6 months away. As part of that discussion, what came out of it was an agreement that is a condition to return to enrollment at the institution and return to campus. The student would have to agree to consistently keep up to date with seeking mental health counseling and also keep in touch with university officials on the events in their life, during which the student denied any present suicidal ideations. Despite these precautions, later, once the student did return, several weeks into the semester, the student committed suicide on campus, and the student's family ended up suing the institution. So what we look at in this case was a situation where the university or the institution was granted summary judgment. Basically, without any disputed facts, what was determined was that the student had denied themselves any intent to commit suicide, any plans to do it. The institution, especially the personnel, not being trained mental health professionals, are entitled to a little bit of latitude here. And what that latitude includes is deferring to mental health professionals and their opinion of the situation. Here, the student was given inpatient care for a week and then discharged without any notation that they represented an imminent threat to themselves or others. The student themselves is also denying any kind of imminent suicidal ideations. Well, to personnel who are not mental health professionals, they're entitled to rely on what the mental health professionals who discharge the student are. They're also entitled to rely in conjunction with those mental health professionals' opinion, the student's own representations about their situation. And here we see a couple of different examples of what the institution did well that the court, in their opinion, decided favorably. Those include once the institution became aware of the suicide attempt, immediately helping secure inpatient hospitalization and treatment. It included the institution working in conjunction with the student's mental health professionals, offering resources both within and outside of the institution, contacting the student's emergency contact and kind of initiating outreach to that personal network, and also requiring the student keep up to date as a condition of returning to the school in the future, not immediately. All of these are steps, precautions that were taken in this situation that resulted in the institution not being found responsible for the unfortunate outcome several months later. For a sort of more recent example where this is still actively playing out, Meyer and Meyer versus Leland Stanford Junior University is an instance where a senior student athlete who was a captain on a team had one of her teammates report being sexually assaulted by another student athlete. Our senior student athlete captain had an incident where she spilled coffee on the alleged assailant. And basically the institution at that point launched an investigation into whether or not that was an example or an instance of intentional misconduct, retaliation, or if it truly was an accident. In the process of that investigation, the student was sent an email notifying her that her degree conference would be put on hold pending the outcome of the investigation, and also notified her that the potential sanctions as a result of the investigation, if it were determined there was an intentional act against the alleged assailant in the sexual misconduct case, could be removal from the university. Unfortunately, shortly after, the next day, the student athlete was found deceased in her dorm room with a copy of the email in question kind of pulled up. The student had in the past been prescribed ADHD medication, which carries with it a potential increased risk of suicidal ideation. This is a case that's still actively pending, actively playing out. We haven't seen any substantive rulings come out of it yet. So there's absolutely there's been no finding to the effect that the students, the university anyway, did anything wrong. It's just alleged at this point by the student's surviving family. Now, this gives us a good example to kind of look at, okay, well, what are some things that might come up in this litigation that we might want to consider? Some of that being, what kind of history does a student have of past mental health challenges, threats of risk to harm to self or others, what the institution knew, but also in the course of the investigation, what kind of support services are offered, how is the outreach handled, were there any kind of indicators that show this may be a sensitive situation that could require it. It also gives us a chance to kind of look at the student athlete context and remember, that a lot of our student athletes, especially at larger institutions, face a unique set of pressures that a lot of other students, may not encounter as frequently. There generally tends to be a, conception that student athletes carry with them a higher degree of mental toughness or kind of appear impervious to some of these things, when in fact that's not the case at all. So it just gives us an opportunity to kind of take a step back and look at, the background of whoever the students involved in communications or outreach in any university investigation is, and consider how, the process of a potential disciplinary proceeding or investigation could have on our student athletes and really students as a whole. So moving on, we'll move to an example of a case involving a student accidental death. Really big distinction here, not an instance of an intentional suicide, also not an instance of intentional harm by one student against another. This is an instance where we have a accident that occurs on campus, but unfortunately results in death. In this instance, a student was in a dorm room, a tower type dorm, climbed out of his 7th floor dorm room onto a narrow ledge about 2 to 3 feet below the window to smoke a cigarette while intoxicated, and unfortunately fell off the ledge and passed away. The student's family sued the university, alleging that it was negligent in 2 ways: for failing to address the danger of a narrow ledge outside of a dorm room window, and then for failing to warn students about the danger. As you might guess, the court agreed that that was an unreasonable expectation, and the university was not in fact responsible to warn students of what a legal buzzword we call an open and obvious danger. In that instance, if for all of our friends on the presentation who went to law school, you probably recall a little bit of these things. These are things that anybody can look at and understand that there is a danger presented in, and an activity, engaging in something that has that open and obvious dangerous component to it, essentially can operate to absolve an institution of liability especially when a student engages in reckless or negligent acts themselves. This is another instance where this is going to vary widely depending on your state, your jurisdiction, applicable premises liability law. But at least in this instance, a 2-foot wide ledge under a window 40 to 50 feet off the ground was considered to be an open and obvious danger, such that the university did not have a duty to warn students of that danger or take action to prevent students from climbing out onto the ledge and engaging in reckless and negligent conduct that could and unfortunately did result in harm. Moving on to our next case, we'll turn to an instance of intentional serious injury, and specifically injury from one student to another. Actually here, we had a student that was enrolled and after enrolling began experiencing auditory hallucinations and some paranoid thoughts. The student was later diagnosed with possible schizophrenia and began receiving mental health treatment. In the course of experiencing these hallucinations and retaining a preliminary diagnosis, the student mentioned these symptoms to several professors and other personnel at the institution. At least this is all alleged from the petition at the stage of the lawsuit right now. Nothing determined one way or another. Eventually, the student, after reporting these things during a chemistry lab on campus, attacked another student and caused serious harm. The student that was attacked, the victim of the attack, filed suit against the institution, claiming that the institution owed her a personal duty to prevent this other student from engaging in violent conduct towards them. This kind of begs the question of what exactly triggers a duty to protect one another. Generally, under most states' common law, there is no duty to protect a third party absent some extenuating circumstance or special relationship. That special relationship can apply very widely in the university context, depending on your state law. Some states have precedent that makes it very, very difficult to show a special relationship. Others are much more flexible in this regard. However, if that duty does exist to protect one from the harm of a third party, the question becomes, okay, well then what exactly is the standard? What triggers that standard? In this case, in a lot of jurisdictions, it's a typical common negligence standard, which requires an institution to protect against harm that's reasonably foreseeable. In this instance, the question becomes, is it reasonably foreseeable that the other student would violently or physically attack a fellow student? Here, on summary judgment, the court determined that there was a dispute as to whether or not the institution had knowledge that the other student basically presented a risk to violently attack their co-students. It's a good example to reinforce that, if in the instances where these situations do find themselves in litigation, that question of whether or not there's knowledge or whether or not a specific violent act is foreseeable is usually a pretty sticky issue that's hard to adjudicate without having an actual finder of fact, which can result in relatively lengthy litigation discovery through trial. And depending on the jurisdiction, you may have a judge who's less likely to resolve a case in an earlier junction with dispositive motion. Moving to another case of a student injury, this time by an unknown person as opposed to a fellow student. We're going to look at an instance that occurred on campus at a parking garage. Just anecdotally, of the litigation matters we handle, it seems that a disproportionate amount of these kind of premises liability driven cases, by third parties committing crimes against students do occur. Parking garages, parking lots, less secure areas, maybe on the outskirts of campus, less well lit, not as heavily traveled, things where you might anticipate that criminal activity could take place. In this particular instance, we had a student that was in an on-campus parking garage walking to a vehicle when she was attacked by two unknown individuals who robbed her and had caused stabbing injuries to the student. The student survived the attack, but then turned and sued the university for failing to take adequate safety precautions that would have prevented her from becoming the victim of the crime. The court ultimately determined here that the university was not responsible was not liable for the injuries to the student because the specific type of crime that occurred, that being a masked armed robbery at knife point in an on-campus parking garage, was not foreseeable. This is a key area where your legal standard is going to be highly variable depending on the jurisdiction that you find yourself in. At least for this case, under the law of the District of Columbia, a heightened foreseeability standard applied, which required the university to have an increased awareness of danger from a particular criminal act. In other words, what would have been required here is a knowledge of similar robbing incidents taking place on campus in a parking garage in order to trigger a duty to kind of prevent that harm. Across other jurisdictions, there's frequently a duty that arises after there is a repeated type of criminal conduct in an area that the institution is responsible for that gives rise to a need to take steps to prevent that harm. Now, what those reasonable steps actually amount to can have a lot of latitude and can vary pretty heavily. This is why we see frequently warning systems to notify students of various types of crimes. Other instances may include increased security patrols as a precautionary measure, general surveillance of areas to sway criminal conduct. Really, the gamut's pretty large here, but it's all about kind of what level of knowledge or prior incidents kind of trigger that responsibility to protect students while they're on campus. Again, very highly variable depending on what jurisdiction you're in. But hopefully this gives you a little bit of an example of kind of the things that we look for in these cases that courts have flagged in a way to be considerations for whether or not legal liability exists. So kind of with those examples in mind and kind of those sticking points, I'm going to turn it over to Scott to talk about some of the considerations you all should consider before an incident takes place. Scott?
Thanks a lot, AJ. And I think you can all see from the cases that AJ just discussed how courts tend to look at these things after the fact, right, with the benefit of hindsight. And of course, can't prevent these things from happening. But I do want to turn now to talking about what we describe as some pre-harm, pre-incident policy considerations that will hopefully help you and the institutions that you work with really minimize the risk of these things occurring at all, understanding that there are times when things happen despite your best efforts. And before jumping into that, just wanted to touch on one of the questions that came up, and I think it ties into the case that AJ was discussing just before turning it over to me relating to, criminal conduct on campus. And I saw a question come through asking about whether we think the Clery Act, the federal law that requires institutions to report certain kinds of crimes that occur on campus or otherwise within the Clery geography, whether that act might be amended to just cover student deaths more generally. It's hard to know. My sense is probably not, in the sense that the Clery Act is really intended to cover the reporting of specific types of crimes. And so if there's a Clery Act crime that results in death and it occurs within the geography that's covered by the Clery Act, then absolutely that's going to need to be reported. And I flag that because I think as we think about these things and as incidents occur, one of the many issues you'll be dealing with, perhaps not the most important one, but an important one nonetheless, is, what if any reporting obligations you might have as an institution under the Clery Act or otherwise if something like this arises. But thank you for that question. So two main topics that I want to talk about here under this area. One, what can we do to reduce the risk of serious injury or suicide? And how do we respond if we come across information indicating that a student might be at heightened risk of either suicide or some other serious injury? As the cases that AJ discussed, sometimes that can be self-harm. Other times there's information indicating that another student or another individual might pose a threat to the student's well-being and physical safety. So in terms of reducing the risk, this is really a multifaceted approach. And I think in the work that I do, I've certainly seen institutions do an incredibly successful job in terms of connecting students with resources, letting them know what resources are available both on campus and off campus when it comes to addressing mental health concerns, other safety-related concerns. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, these are some of the steps that they recommend taking, which when you hear them might sound obvious, but I think the key issue for institutions, or an important issue for institutions to consider, is how can they help students have these resources, have these coping mechanisms. And so promoting social connectedness, I mean, that happens in all sorts of ways at all different kinds of institutions, but that's a key factor often in helping students address any mental health concerns, feel like they have support, feel like they are able to be connected within the community. That seems to be a very important aspect. Similarly, helping students learn how to cope. Substance abuse is a big problem in our society, and our campuses are no exception. But what coping mechanisms, other than things like substance abuse, cutting behavior, self-harming behavior, how can we work with students to try to develop more productive coping mechanisms to try to address any mental health concerns? And I think the next one is really key. And again, I think institutions are doing terrific work on this front in terms of removing the stigma that's associated with seeking counseling or other mental health support, and really empowering students to seek help, both for themselves, but also others in the community. That one student might be worried about a friend or a teammate. And how do you let students know and give them the power to be able to seek help and know where to go if they feel like either they themselves or a fellow student is in need of mental health services, and then making those services, whether they're available on campus or in the community, readily available and easily accessible. This slide covers a number of the same and similar issues. The JED Foundation, as many of you probably know, has done a lot of work in this area in terms of promoting student mental health, affording and providing resources to institutions. Their website has a bunch of great information on it and resources that can really help institutions try to grapple with some of these issues surrounding risk reduction. And I've often accessed them myself, and would definitely recommend it to you. And featured on this slide are some of the strategies that the JED Foundation promotes, but I really would encourage you to take a look at their website if you haven't done so already. Another key issue in terms of reducing the risk, and I already touched on this, but that is really making it easy for students in crisis or students who know someone who they believe to be in crisis, making it easy for them to access resources. Taking a look at your websites, your web pages, if you have an on-campus counseling service, making sure that website is easy to find through a Google search. Any emergency number is readily available so that somebody who's in crisis or in an emergency situation can easily find the number to call and where to go for help, so there just isn't confusion. And I'll leave it to the folks that organize and structure web pages to figure out exactly how best to optimize that. But I think it's a helpful reminder to really think about it. If you're someone who's in crisis, you're someone who's struggling, would you be able to figure out very easily where to go on your website to gain access to support and resources? Another good resource, the Education Development Center recommends a number of programs to try to support student mental health. And here too, I don't have to tell all of you what demands there are for these services on campus. It's overwhelming, and I know a lot of folks who work for campus mental health centers feel overwhelmed by the demand, and know that there are a lot of students who need those resources and support services. These are some examples of other types of resources and programs that are recommended to try to help promote and advance student mental health. Bystander support campaigns, that is for people who might know someone who is in crisis or in need of support or resources. What do you do? And whether it's a fellow student or another employee at the institution, training and educational programming around these issues in terms of what signals or signs to be looking for in students so that you can connect them with resources. To pause on that for just a moment, I don't mean to suggest that faculty and staff who aren't trained mental health professionals should be left all on their own to try to figure this out, identify and diagnose people. Not at all. But I think we can all sort of learn what things to be on the lookout for, what types of comments, what types of conduct, what types of behavior might indicate that someone might be in distress and in need of mental health services or other supports, and knowing where to go on campus, whether that's to student affairs or student development, or if you're at an institution that has a non-campus mental health service, knowing to contact and engage with them rather than feeling like untrained professionals need to figure this all out on their own. It's more about connecting the dots, figuring out what resources are available on campus. And I'll touch on these issues a little bit more. An important component of this is having, what's often described as culturally competent mental health care. What does that mean? Students come from a variety of racial, demographic backgrounds, and trying to make sure that you can connect students with support that will really help them based on their own individual circumstances. Sometimes that can involve having that staff on campus. Sometimes it can involve connecting students with other resources that might be available in the community if you're at an institution that has more limited staffing and resources, but really trying to focus on the individual needs that students might have based on their own individual circumstances, and just taking that into account and figuring out how to best support and serve students. So of course, when it comes to assessing the risk, I touched on this a moment ago, it's not that the expectation or the goal is to have everyone on campus really turn into mental health professionals, not at all. And in fact, it's really important to try to make sure that the risk assessment is done by people who are qualified to do it. Having worked with a number of mental health professionals and representing the schools that I work with, I've learned a lot from them in terms of how they think about assessing risk and deciding on tailored, individualized interventions that hopefully will help support students who are in distress and in need of those resources. And a key part of that is mental health professionals being able to get information from others on campus, whether it's employees or other students, so that they understand what the concerns are and that they're able to figure out how to best help and support students who might be in need of those resources. So it's more about educating people to recognize warning signs, to recognize red flags, not leaving them to deal with these situations on their own, but knowing where to go for more help. There are a number of warning signs of suicide, self-harm. These are some of them. This list is not intended to suggest that every time someone does one of these things or engages in some of these behaviors, that means they're going to actually commit suicide, engage in serious self-harm. But these are some of the things that can help the campus community understand what some of the warning signs are, and again, know what resources to perhaps recommend to students who are suffering or in distress, and being able to engage with mental health professionals to try to partner together to figure out how best to support students. If someone is at risk of suicide, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center offers several best practices. Some of them are listed here. I think the main thing is figuring out how best to connect someone with treatment resources, mental health professionals who can really step in and engage with the student more proactively to try to serve them. When in doubt, obviously, folks on campus can always call emergency response, but oftentimes the first line of defense is connecting with an on-campus mental health counseling service if you have that at your institution, or looking to what resources might be available in your community. But obviously, if there's an emergent situation and you're really worried about someone posing an imminent risk of harm, then contacting emergency support can always be a backstop for that. Next, and I saw a couple questions come through, which are very good questions about how do we sort of balance confidentiality, particularly when it comes to protected health information. How do we share information in a way that can help students while also being mindful of their privacy and confidentiality rights? When it comes to mental health information, it may be that the federal statute, HIPAA, that governs certain health records may apply and may have limitations in terms of a mental health counselor's ability to share information. Many state laws, including in Illinois, also have those limitations. All of those statutes that I'm aware of, at least, have an exception in there that allows for the sharing of information if there is a true emergency situation. You, of course, have to check your own state law and want to make sure you're getting legal advice, but there's usually a way in a truly dire emergency situation to be able to share information to try to help a student who's in the midst of a crisis. Similarly, FERPA, a law I'm sure you're all familiar with that governs information that's in student education records, also has a health or safety emergency exception that allows institutions to share information with parents or others. If there really is a health or safety emergency, someone's at risk of suicide, someone's at risk of harm, that exception allows institutions to share information with parents or others who might be in a situation to help the student to mitigate the risk. Basically, from a legal perspective, as long as you have a good faith, rational basis for doing it, the Department of Education has said they're not going to step in and try to second guess those determinations. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but the bottom line is that if there is a health or safety emergency, you're able to share information with parents or others to try to help protect the safety of the student. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex to address some post-incident issues.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. And thank you for all of the amazing questions that we've been receiving in the dialogue even. Some of you have been posing more comments than questions, and we really love that. Part of learning about this topic is that we can learn from one another what's happening all across our campuses across the country. So we really appreciate the feedback. And in some instances, I wish you all could see some of the questions coming through so that you all could really engage with it. If this was more of an interactive training, maybe we would have that, but such is our webinar format. So this section, we're going to focus on the post-incident response. We're going to cover three main areas related to this portion, and you'll see those on your screen. What policies should we consider implementing? And there were a few questions about that. Hopefully we answer them along the way, but feel free to pose them again if we don't cover that as thoroughly as we get to. How do you go about communicating with your campus community and the media following a student death or serious injury? And then conducting follow-up assessments or post-incident assessments, as some institutions call them. When I say follow-up assessments, I mean reviewing specific case studies, but also big picture issues that may have arisen from one incident that may impact not just that one student, but your entire student population. So with that, let's get started on first focusing on the policy perspective. So from a big picture standpoint, as it relates to policy considerations for post-incident assessments, is that we really strongly recommend you consider having policies in place before the situation happens on your campus. Having a policy that ensures the strategies and approaches you want for your campus community in this time of a student death is not ad hoc. We don't want it to be an ad hoc situation. We want you to be able to rely on your policies. And institutions really benefit from having a structured response that focuses on providing targeted and generalized community resources to those that are impacted by suicide, which we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide, and then minimizing the risk of suicide contagion. We had a question related to that, and again, hopefully we get to that in the coming slides. As a way I've seen this done really effectively is creating a multidisciplinary committee to establish a post-vention strategy that's reflective of your institution's values and establishes a post-vention approach modeled after best practices that we've talked about throughout this webinar. Keep in mind, from a best practices standpoint, any policies you have regarding student death should treat all student deaths the same way. Differing approaches, as you'll see on the screen, but I want to make sure we underscore it, any sort of differing approaches can increase or reinforce stigma around student death by suicide especially. And the reason we flag this in particular is student death by suicide tends to be the one that if a student death is treated differently, just in our anecdotal experience, it is that type that has stood out in our practice. In these post-incident assessments, so thinking that through before an incident occurs, making sure you're reducing and mitigating that stigma is going to be really important. So now that we've covered some of the broader principles, let's jump into some of the specifics from a policy standpoint. So this slide really talks about the many things you want to consider outlining in post-incident policies, or at least considering whether it's appropriate for your community to address in policy, procedure. Some institutions rely on practice, but really policy is the stronger approach. When we're putting together this list based on our own practices and experiences, helping clients draft these policies, either in advance of a student death or after the fact, we realize that a common thread among this list is getting each part of the campus community together. You'll see in every one of these bullet points, a different facet of the campus community is being touched on. This area of student death is one that absolutely touches on each part of your campus community. So I encourage you to look at your policies that you already have in place. It sounds like many of you, at least from the feedback we've received from the questions, have these sorts of policies in place, and think through which members of your campus communities are covered within your policies and which ones may not be that you want to incorporate. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on the next, on the second to last item, which is communication. We got a lot of questions about that, so I want to make sure we touch on that as well and how to go about communicating related to these issues. Communication is so important in this space, and the timing of the communication is also so critical. As you can see on the screen, according to the Department of Health and Human Services, suicide contagion occurs when direct or indirect exposure to suicidal behavior precedes an increase in suicidal behavior in persons at risk for suicide, especially in adolescents and young adults. And here our presentation is really focusing on that student population. And so the 18 to 22-year-olds is going to be the largest population as identified by the Department of Health and Human Services. So that brings us to our next poll question. And for the polls, you'll see that these appear on your screen. You actually have to make the selection. We got a couple questions related to that, so I wanted to make sure to highlight that you have to take us off from being minimized maybe. Hopefully we're not minimized on your screen, but if we are, take us back onto the main page and actually select your answer so we can see those results come through. So the question that's being posed is, does your institution have a written policy, protocol, or practice in place to address student deaths? The first choice is yes. The second choice is it's not written, but we do have a practice in place that we all generally know. The next choice is it's not written and we don't have a practice in place, or the final option is I'm actually not sure, I don't know. We have really great results coming in, so we'll give a few more seconds. Okay, let's see what those results look like. So about a little over 40% of you say yes, you have a written policy, protocol, or practice, that it's actually written in place. About 30% of you say it's not written, but we do have a practice in place that we all generally know. Almost 10% of you say that we don't have anything written and we don't actually have a practice in place. And then there's about 22% of you that say you're not sure what your institution's system is, which I'm really glad that we started adding those I don't knows in there. I had a client give that feedback as part of this webinar series in the past. And so I always make sure to include that thanks to that client feedback. So we really do listen to the results that you submit after the fact and appreciate that. So now that we've talked about that from a polling standpoint, where you all stand on a policy perspective, this slide focuses on the communications with students. We'll talk about communicating with faculty and staff on the next slide because each really need their own pieces. There are many important tips on this slide, including addressing the death openly, directly, and quickly, but keeping in mind the family and close community of the deceased student with all of your communications is really going to be important. One of the most important tips that I've seen used very effectively, but then also sometimes ineffectively, is the final point, providing immediate access to resources for students. And I know Scott did a great job highlighting this in his portion in terms of in advance of an incident. And for whatever reason, after the incident, sometimes we forget about that. And so making sure that you're including those resources after an incident occurs is going to be really critical. Having a variety of free resources available, like we list on the slide, and sharing those with your campus community is going to be so important. This slide focuses on communications as it relates to faculty and staff. Make sure you know what resources are available. Similar to what I mentioned on the other slide, it feels a little bit maybe more intuitive for students to think about those resources, and we occasionally will say faculty and staff will know how to find those on their own. Let's not make that mistake. I think thinking through how faculty and staff also need to be supported is going to be really critical. This isn't something we want to overlook or put on the back burner. A student passing away on your campus absolutely impacts the faculty and staff, everyone from professors to academic life coaches to resident directors and everyone in between. So keeping that in mind as well. We've spent a lot of time talking about developing policies and practices, and I see our time is slowly dwindling away from me. So I'll get through the next few slides for Scott to be able to wrap up. But in terms of some of the other best practices, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the importance of training on all of this information. Walking through your policies and also your communication strategies in the form of hands-on training with as many of your campus leaders as possible is going to be so critical. But not just walking through the policy language, but actually role-playing what each person would do and how they would go about doing it. With that type of training, I always make sure when I'm leading those discussions to make sure that it's really a discussion and that we're working collaboratively, more so than probably any other training that I typically do, since every person plays such a critical role in the process of responding to a student death, making sure each person feels confident in their roles, being able to ask questions during that training and build that foundation for if and when this does happen within your community. It's going to be really worthwhile in the long run. This slide talks about some things to avoid and some things to use instead from a great resource. Again, our slides are provided to you at the bottom of your audience console, so I won't go through each of these given our time constraints. But I do want to move to the next slide and talk a little bit in terms of the final piece as it relates to conducting an assessment in response to a student death, is to think again through each part of your campus community in terms of personnel, but also in terms of your physical campus too. Many of those are listed on your screen. And with that, I will turn it over to Scott to bring us into the home stretch.
Thanks a lot, Alex, and thank you, everyone. I will go ahead and put this hypothetical up here, which really touches on a lot of the issues that Alex just addressed in her remarks. We won't have time to get through it during our time today, but we're happy to share our thoughts on it when we respond to the remaining questions. And thank you again for all of those questions, and thank you for joining us here today. We really appreciate it. We hope this was helpful to you. As a reminder, This program has been approved for legal education hours, and you can click on the CEU icon at the bottom of your screen to access that information. You'll receive a certificate of attendance and a recording of our program today via email tomorrow. And finally, please be sure to complete the short survey regarding our program today. We really value your feedback and use it to make plans for our future events. That concludes our webinar today. Thank you again, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of the day.